My name is Marjorie Jean-Pierre. I'm Senior Director at the U.S. Energy Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar. For those of us joining from other countries, thank you so much. I say good afternoon and good evening. And thank you for joining us on a topic that we think of as great importance as we present just transition under our USAID program, Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships. Unfortunately, due to scheduling, our acting executive director, Sheila Hollis, was unable to join us this morning, but she was gracious enough to send a recording for us to begin our webinar.
Good evening. My name is Sheila Hollis, and I'm the acting executive director of the United States Energy Association. For those of you not familiar with USEA, it's a nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan institution created back in 1924, established on two significant pillars. First, we convene, educate, and provide key resources for the American energy system. And second, we work in close long-term partnerships with the United States Agency for International Development, known as USAID, the State Department, and the Department of Energy. Those efforts seek to better the lives of people throughout the world. We look to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. Thus, we seek to assist in the progress towards Goal 7 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, and Goal 13, climate action. I'm delighted to be here today, even if through a video message, as we collaborate on a just transition, reducing the human impact under the Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnership. In short, AMP UP program. I welcome you all to the next 90 minutes of deliberation on the socioeconomic implications and the new workforce development opportunities for USAID-assisted countries in their transition from fossil fuels. In other words, a just transition. The AMP UP program is centered around peer-to-peer relationships and strong practitioner and stakeholder networks to support net zero goals. The program is funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation, DDI. AMP UP is a consortium of 5 organizations, including Arizona State University, MK Advisors, NRECA International, Segura Consulting, and the United States Energy Association. I would like to extend my welcome to all the speakers who volunteered their valuable time today for this webinar, starting with our own moderator, Nathan Johnson of Arizona State University, and panelist, Kristen Madler, Clean Energy Coordinator, U.S. Agency for International Development, Sandeep Pai, Senior Research Lead at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Carolee Ramlee, Senior Principal Attorney for the Salt River Project, and Shweta Srinivasan, Program Manager for Energy at the India Climate Collaborative. The need for an equitable and just transition is not just a hot topic discussed at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, but an important topic that straddles the world's climate ambitions while centering on people and communities. The USAID Climate Strategy 2022-30 includes enabling systemic changes by catalyzing transformative shifts to net zero and climate resilient pathways as a strategic objective. This will help simultaneously deliver on climate targets and also on sustainable development goals to achieve a more equitable, sustainable, and climate safe world. Thus, we need to support the management of transition of the fossil fuel plants and to scale up clean energy plants. These steps are essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets of the Paris Agreement in parallel with preparation of the workforce throughout the entire energy supply chain. The energy industry, therefore, must build opportunities for high-quality jobs for displaced workers and prepare them with new skill sets. Social interventions are required to secure workers' rights and their livelihoods and utilities. We will work globally with a systemic approach that includes representation from governments, financial institutions, and the private sector to identify collective strategies and policies to assist the communities adversely affected by the transition. All this points to the timeliness of our webinar today, hosted by the AMP UP program that will always support a just transition as its highest priority. I wish you the very best and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sheila, in your absence, for taking the time for those wonderful remarks and for opening our webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce Kristen Madler, Clean Energy Coordinator at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the AOR for the AMP-UP program. Kristen?
Thanks so much, Marjorie. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. As the energy sector transitions away from fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy, there are many opportunities and also complex challenges that will have real, meaningful impacts on people's day-to-day lives. And we cannot properly address climate change without ensuring the workers and communities that are tied to this sector have a voice in shaping a sustainable future economy. Just transition applied to global climate change refers to transitioning the global economy to a low carbon, resilient one in a way that seeks positive environmental, social, and economic outcomes, while delivering equitable benefits and does no harm. This is how we define a just transition in USAID's new climate strategy. And a critical component of this is the bit about seeking positive outcomes and delivering equitable benefits. Our response to the climate crisis presents an opportunity to change the world for a better. And the climate strategy calls for transforming the systems upon which our society is built, like our food, infrastructure, and health systems, to build a more resilient, prosperous, and equitable world. This also creates a ton of opportunity. New industry and economies will create new jobs, which presents a chance to reshape our labor markets to be more inclusive and creates new opportunities to advance gender equity. There must be inclusive and participatory decision-making and development processes that ensure justice in the transition, developing demand-driven skills and labor matching, protecting and enhancing workers' rights, safeguarding community health and human rights of affected individuals, including in Indigenous and local communities. And technical partnerships and community engagement are fundamental to support this transition. So through the AMP-UP program, we envision collaborating with stakeholders on just transition sector job resilience, climate transition pathways for reaching net zero, and deep decarbonization. We plan to share lessons learned and models that other transitioning communities across both local and national levels have used that peers can reference and build upon to meet their unique needs. So today we look forward to learning from snapshots of work on the ground from around the world. I would like to thank USCA and the AMP-UP team for organizing this session, and especially to thank each of our speakers and moderator for sharing their time and expertise here today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for your wonderful comments. They're a great way to base the structure of our webinar and for giving a wonderful description of the AMP-UP program. It's now, I'm pleased to now pass on the running of the webinar to the capable hands of Dr. Nathan Johnson, Director and Associate Professor, Arizona State University. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of USCA, and we're pleased that ASU is a consortium member in the AMP-UP program under Nate's leadership. Nate, I pass it on to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Marjorie. And it's good to see you all here today. Thanks for joining us. It's my privilege to give a bit of an overview of what a just transition is, since it's a fairly new concept, both in definition and how do we apply the goals of a just transition to our work. And so I'll go through an overview, and then my colleagues on the call will talk through case studies of a just transition from around the world to give you an understanding about how we're applying this emerging need and emerging concept in our operations and our strategy. So to think about the energy transition as a whole, as we're all aware of, it's a global shift to renewables. And so lower costs, energy security, climate change mitigation, and more. And as Kristen kindly indicated, the just transition and that pursuit for equity is part of USAID's climate strategy. And so as we're transitioning to a more renewable future or a low carbon or no carbon future, that transition is being driven by business factors, but also institutions, governments, development agencies, financing institutions, increasingly so, thought leaders, and also utilities and communities. But as we look at the history of the energy industry, which has been required, mandated, regulated, and expected to provide as best as they can safe, reliable, and low-cost energy, and then we add renewable energy or the climate change component, that shifts from the conventional paradigm of fossil fuel powered and thermal generation to more renewable generation, whether it be dispatchable or variable in nature. But as that society is making that change, and as institutions are driving forward to that change, what happens to the industry that we have built our economies on today? What happens to the industry that has helped everyone on this phone call, build their careers and their families and their own businesses around? What happens to the workers that we expected to get us here today, and we are transitioning away from that paradigm of workers? So when we think about that, it's not just, as an example, the coal-fired power plant. It's all aspects, as Sheila said, of the energy value chain. It's the coal mine, it's the railway workers, it's the equipment vendors, it's the O&M providers, operation and maintenance providers of the thermal generation power plants. It's all of that. And so when we think about the entire energy value chain, it's not just the folks that work directly in the power plant for the utility or an EPC for engineering, procurement, construction, and the O&M after, but it's also the indirect impact on their communities. What about the grocery stores? What about the department stores? What about other types of consumer products, fuel stations and more? It's the other aspects of the economy. And we see that affected even more so in areas that are remote and potentially indigenous populations, where thermal generation around the world is more commonly installed anyway. And so when we look at those smaller communities that are often more vulnerable to large economic sectors being removed from their economy, what is our understanding of our responsibility to support that community? And it's not just in that case, the energy value chain, the supporting services, but then also through the reduction of tax revenue. What happens to the school system? What happens to the municipal services? What happens if we're making this energy change to reduce climate change, but we're reducing the amount of equity that people can have for how their kids are growing up to be productive members of society? So as we take a look at the connections of what the transition means, and as Kristen indicated, equity is essential in a just transition. What is the envelope of our responsibility? Because as we look at a just transition, that asserts that society has a responsibility, institutions have a responsibility, and we have a responsibility to the individuals, communities, and even the supporting industries to the energy sector to provide them with equity in that transition. So with that, that's a little bit of the conceptual overview of the just transition. And I'm very happy now as we're going into a series of case studies, 3 case studies, and more remarks from each presenter. And so I'll introduce the first presenter, and we'll have a period of remarks by the presenter and slideshow, and then we'll move to the next presenter. And then at the end, we'll have an open Q&A. If you have questions for the presenter during the course of the presentations, please go ahead and post those into the chat, and I'll grab those at the end when the moderated Q&A, and then ask the presenter at that time. So feel free to enter those at any time. Sandeep Pai, please join us. He is a senior research lead for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sandeep, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you for having me. I'll just go ahead and share my slides. Right. Thank you so much, and it's truly a pleasure to be here to talk about just transition, which is a topic that is really close to my heart. So without wasting much time, I would just dive right in and try to kind of give you a flavor of what are some of the key elements of just transition, which is very common around the world, and we have seen this through some studies that we have conducted. So the larger context that basically Nate was talking about is that why we are trying to transition beyond local environmental reasons is the issue of climate change, right? So it's very, very clear from reports after reports that meeting climate change requires massively scaling down fossil fuels in a very short amount of time, in a matter of a few decades. The system that we have built over the last 150 years need to be scaled down very quickly. So as the world thinks about transitioning away from this, undertaking this technological transition, which is from fossil fuels towards renewables, the key question is what happens to the future of fossil fuel workers, such as coal workers, their communities, dependent regions, and that is kind of a very, very key question to the and very central to just transition. Um, this is a concept that has grown in importance globally. This was a concept that started in the US in 70s, but over time it has infused and diffused into the climate discourse. And this has become a very mainstream topic in many countries, and even internationally, many organizations are thinking about this topic in a very focused manner. So at the COP24, there was a Solidarity and Just Transition Sicilia Declaration, where several heads of states signed together a declaration saying that, as we shift our economies towards clean energy systems, we have to ensure a just transition for workforce that creates decent work and quality jobs. And the core argument of this, the justice argument of the transition here, is that these workers have provided the fuel that built the modern world from the Industrial Revolution and then the oil era and so on and so forth. So, and this line of thinking you will see in the likes of ILO and UNFCCC and IPCC arguing for this kind of sort of like justice framing of why just transition is important. So beyond the multilateral agencies and thinking at a global scale, actually at many countries, starting from US to Canada to UK, South Africa, are formulating just transition laws, policies, even subnational jurisdictions. You have Colorado's Just Transition Act. You have, New Mexico has a just very strong just transition legislation as part of their larger legislation, and many countries are actively working on just transition. They have task forces. They have set aside large sums of money to undertake this transition process. But even despite all this, this is really at very early stages of planning and implementation, and whether this just transition is going to be a success or a failure is something we'll see in the future. But there's a lot of interest even at subnational and national levels. So with that global background, I thought it'll be more useful to go local and provide some case study examples from emerging economies. So on your left, you see Mpumalanga, which is a province in the eastern side of South Africa. In one province, they produce 90% of coal, and it is also home to about 70% of their coal-fired power plants. On the right, you have India, a state called Jharkhand in India, which is at the heart of coal mining belt in India. It's where coal started in India, and several local districts, which is like a county equivalent, are deeply dependent on coal mining for various things. So with these two case studies in mind, I'm going to talk about a few elements of just transition and what just transition would mean for such regions which are so dependent on coal. And this was based on a study we conducted last year along with climate investment funds, where we focused on three key elements, which is how can these places diversify their local economies? Second, what are the ways in which environmental remediation of coal mines and power plants can be done with the emphasis for job creation? And finally, who are the stakeholders, including who are the underrepresented stakeholders involved in any just transition planning in these areas? So we conducted several interviews, with experts, with academia, including with coal workers. We did a literature analysis. We also analyzed policy documents, and we collected some data. So whatever I'm speaking will be based on this methodology and the results from this methodology. So before I dive into the elements and talk about the three elements that I mentioned, I think it's really important to understand that coal is an ecosystem, and this is a way to summarize what Nate was saying, that when we think about just transition, we should not think about just as a jobs problem. So this is a diagram of the coal ecosystem in India. So if you look at the three boxes, so starting with the first box, coal mining and power contributes to national revenues, it contributes to district revenues. Railway in India is highly subsidized because they overcharge the coal transport segment, which they subsidize the passenger segment. And then coal companies also spend it's mandatory in India to spend money under corporate social responsibility. Then the second box you see, there's the direct jobs of miners and power plant workers. There's contractors. There's all sorts of supply chain workers. There's something called informal jobs, which is very relevant in emerging economies such as India. And then there is, like US, India also has almost 600,000 coal pensioners whose pensions will depend on the coal sector. And then the last box on the right is basically about the household cooking fuel, the industrial fuel. Coal companies also create mixed use infrastructure. Sometimes they provide free electricity and water. And one thing to mention here is that in India's case and also in South Africa's case, most of the coal sector is state owned, so it's not privately owned sector. So that's something through their mandate also there is a welfare mandate that they have to do some of these things. So overall, out of the 700 odd districts, about 284 districts have some kind of coal spillover. About 3.8 million direct and indirect jobs. This does not include induced informal jobs, exist in about 159 districts. About 500,000 pensioners, as I was mentioning, in 199 districts. And then $144 million are spent under CSR by coal companies. And local governments collect district mineral fund in about 52 districts, of about $500 million per year. So that was the ecosystem in India, but this is sort of I won't go into the details, but South Africa has its own coal ecosystem. There's some differences, but by and large, you'll see that many elements remain the same. But if I have to point out one difference, municipal services in areas where coal mining and power exists is something that you often see coal companies provide. That's something that doesn't exist in India. So there's differences, but it has its own ecosystem. So what does it tell us? That we have to think, when we think about just transition, we have to think about a coal ecosystem that is not just about jobs. It goes way beyond jobs. So our recommendation is that any just transition plan on early coal retirement needs to focus on the whole ecosystem rather than just jobs. So now coming to the three elements. One of the key elements of any just transition has to be local economic regional diversification. And what we think is that there's two pillars to this. One is the provincial or state diversification. The state itself sets out and creates industrial policies, and it has various sectors that have the potential that it could diversify into. And then you have the state-owned companies or the other coal companies that themselves can diversify locally to clean energy or any other businesses, and that would also create jobs. And so these are key pillars. And we find that in both places, there's lots of sectors that have potential, although also has many challenges. And we'll list some of them. I can't get into the details of that for this presentation, but in the report, we explain in detail what those are. So what are some of the insights? We find that in both of these very local coal dependent regions, there's a lot of potential in sectors ranging from agriculture to renewable energy, but contains many, many challenges. And we also think that the state-owned enterprises can diversify, and that has potential to further just transitions. But what needs to happen in order to do that is that long-term pathways, pathways that last for decades need to be created for these alternate sectors to flourish in these areas, and that should be grounded in obviously local priorities. The other thing we found is that while there is some diversification plans at the state level, also these coal companies are trying to diversify, there's no sort of like coordination among them. So we recommend that there be better coordination. And in our current project, we are actually trying to bring the state governments and the coal companies together so that their diversification plans have sort of like, some convergence. Then the next element is, there's a lot of coal mines and power plants. There's legacy mines, and there's current mines that are lying abandoned, and that, while it is a problem because they leak and they have tailings ponds and etc., but we feel that that's a great opportunity also and a great source for just transition in the future. So what we find is that if proper remediation of these mines and power plants happen and repurposing of plants happen, that could create a lot of local jobs at the very places where there will be decline. But there's lots of legal, institutional, and financial challenges to undertake such a transition process. And rehabilitation must be based on land use policies, involving local stakeholders. So the two recommendations we have is to strengthen regulatory regimes for effective remediation of current and legacy mines and plants. And the most important recommendation is that any remediation must be based on land use policies. What that means is, like, what would be the industry of the future when you remediate this mine, and how many jobs can it create, and so on. It cannot be just a natural remediation. You're planting trees and your beautification, you're creating a beautiful place out of it, but you actually have to think about job creation. And so a land use policy is important. Coming to the final recommendation is that what we did is we created like a stakeholder mapping exercise of who are the different stakeholders that will be involved, or that are sort of like important in thinking about just transition. So this is an example from Jharkhand, from India. So you have the ministries, the governments, you have the policy groups and universities, you have coal companies, you have unions, and you have activists. So what we find is that in the current just transition discourse, there are many underrepresented groups, and you can see that we have highlighted them in yellow. So from local governments to sort of like smaller unions to some individual leaders, they are not represented in sort of like coal discussions around just transition. So that is something that needs to change. Based upon this, this element of just transition, what we want to say is that there's 5 categories of just transition, 5 categories of stakeholders important to any just transition planning. And this is true for both places, and perhaps true for other places as well. And there are many underrepresented stakeholders. And so it's very, very important that future just transition planning engages with them. And so this is sort of a flavor of what, some of the key elements of just transition could look like on the ground. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is just to start the conversation and to show how complex and complicated it is on the ground. So thank you so much once again for having me, and it's a pleasure, and I'm happy to take any questions in the Q&A session.
That's perfect. Thank you, Sandeep. And thanks for sharing your perspective on how you define the ecosystem, and also clearly identified and differentiated the different types of components, and then also the stakeholders, which, as you would expect, are different for the local situation and status. And we'd love to hear a little bit more in the Q&A about the process you follow to get the correct representation of the categories and the stakeholders involved. So thanks for sharing your time, and we'll loop back in with Q&A in a little bit. Thank you. So next up, we kindly have Carolee Rameli. She is with Salt River Project as a senior principal attorney to speak about some of the examples from the United States, specifically in the state of Arizona. I'll hand it over to you, Carolee.
Are you seeing my slide?
Not yet.
Not sure why.
And then just
Okay.
at the bottom of the Zoom window of.
Is that it now?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to try to dive right into my presentation, which I'm going to be focusing on. This is just an example from the United States, the closure of the Navajo generating station, which is located on the Navajo Nation here in Arizona. First, a quick overview of Salt River Project. Salt River Project is made up of the Salt River Valley Water Users Association, which was formed in 1903. That is primarily for providing water to the Phoenix metropolitan area. Over time, as we needed to develop power for driving the pumps for those wells, we became the Salt River Project Agricultural Improvement District. And we now serve about 1 million power customers in Phoenix. That's just a quick overview. Salt River Project was the operating agent for the Navajo generating station, which we operated on behalf of multiple participants. Just a background on the Navajo generating station, or NGS, as we called it. Construction began in 1969, and it began operation, the first unit began commercial operation in 1975. It was the largest coal plant west of the Mississippi at 2,250 megawatts. And it was fueled by low sulfur bituminous coal, which was mined on both the Navajo Nation lands and some shared use lands between the Navajo and the Hopi tribe. We had nearly 500 full-time employees, more than 90% of whom were Navajo. And I've got listed there the participants in the plants, which included both the federal government, United States, through the Bureau of Reclamation, Public Power in Salt River Project in LA, and then investor-owned utilities through APS, Tucson Electric Power, and Nevada Energy. Why did NGS close? Decision was made to close NGS in about 2017, with natural gas prices being as low as they were and the cost of operations. Coal plants were becoming more uncompetitive. There were cleaner alternatives. And as Nate has talked about, the transition to cleaner energy was also a consideration. And we also had a lease that was coming up for termination in 2019. We originally planned to close the plant in mid-2017 to comply with lease requirements, to have all of the facilities removed by the end of the lease. But because we wanted to provide a transition for the Navajo Nation and our employees, we worked with the Navajo Nation to negotiate a new lease, which allowed the plant to continue operation for another couple years through December 22nd of 2019. Just to highlight a few of the things that were done to help the Navajo Nation transition. I mentioned one, we extended the operations for another couple of years to try to give the Navajo Nation time and to work with the Navajo Nation to transition. We do provide annual lease payments that actually go on for 35 years. So that provides some continuing revenue for the nation, and that covers effectively some transmission lines that we have on the nation and gives us access to do some of the ongoing maintenance work that we are doing there. We provided the nation with what we would refer to as a coal royalties assurance. We assured them that for at least the last 2 years of the operation of NGS, they would receive a minimal amount of coal royalties, even if we had to scale back the operation of the plant. There were a number of assets that were retained by the Navajo Nation. And we worked with the Navajo Nation to agree on which on-site buildings they wanted to retain. We provided them a pump station for water, and a pipeline. And then there were some other facilities. One of the buildings that we provided or left for the Navajo Nation was a fairly new warehouse. And that building is already being used for another business at this point, even while we are continuing our decommissioning of the plant. And that's a manufactured homes business that is operating there already on the site. We are hoping that more will be able to use the buildings and other assets that are left. To help facilitate the nation's transition to renewable energy, another part of the agreement was that we provided the Navajo Nation with transmission access. The owners of the Navajo generating station also owned associated transmission lines. With that plant shutting down, there was the ability to make 500 megawatts of that transmission available to the Navajo Nation to support renewable energy projects that come onto the Navajo Nation. And we also agreed to do Navajo hiring preference and workforce development. We've agreed to hire Navajo businesses to help in the decommissioning process. They needed to be registered with the Navajo Nation. And then we've encouraged all of our subcontractors to hire Navajos to do the work for the decommissioning. So in addition to those efforts, which were done by all of the NGS participants, Salt River Project did provide additional transition support to the Navajo Nation and to Page, a nearby community. We provided jobs and retraining for all of our employees. We provided in-kind services through energy planning and economic development assistance. We also supported the Navajo Nation Energy and Natural Resources Economic Development Roadmap. We served as effectively a technical advisor to them, providing the expertise of many of our employees. We provided scholarships and sponsored programs at nearby community colleges and worked with NAU. We agreed to pursue renewable energy projects on the Navajo Nation, and we've participated in Light Up Navajo, which is a program sponsored by the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority and the APPA, or Association of Public Power, to connect homes on the Navajo reservation to power. And I'll walk through some of these in a little bit more detail. For jobs and retraining, SRP made a decision that every NGS employee would be offered a position at another SRP facility if they wanted that, if they wanted to do that. For many of them, that was going to require them to move. That's a challenge. Some employees did not want to do that. We did 300 Navajo generating station employees that we retrained and redeployed to other facilities. We developed a workforce development strategy for the Page and Lechi'i area, which is the right around the Navajo generating station. And we worked with the Northern Arizona Regional Reemployment Center for employees who wanted to go ahead and leave SRP and find other positions. One program that was quite successful was we created an apprentice program, which was for employees that wanted to be retrained for work in the technology field. It was a program that a number of our employees went through, and after that program, they were given a permanent position in a technology field after their apprenticeship. And that program was quite successful. With respect to economic development, we provided support through sponsorships, expertise, and other assistance. We provided expertise and assistance to the Navajo Nation Economic Development Department and the Division of Natural Resources. And we worked with NAU, Coconino County, and the town of Page to try to work with them to address some of their economic development issues. As I mentioned before, we provided expertise. We have employees that specialize in economic development. And so we provided guidance and input as requested by the Navajo Nation and these other entities. The Navajo Nation determined that it would develop an energy roadmap, and the Energy and Resource Economic Development Roadmap for the Navajo Nation. For that, we decided the Navajo Nation needed to drive that effort. They needed to decide what they wanted to pursue for future economic development. But Salt River Project provided employees to serve as a technical facilitator to help develop options available for energy and natural resources economic development on the nation. And listed here are just a few of the programs and opportunities that were considered and evaluated for the Navajo Nation to pursue later on if they so choose. Because we knew that the loss of the Navajo generating station was going to impact the local community colleges and other educational institutions, we provide an ongoing resource to the Navajo Nation in the Page Lechi'i area by assisting with educational opportunities through scholarships and grants to educational opportunities. We provided a $75,000 grant to NAU to support their tribal environmental education outreach program. We've provided scholarships to the Navajo Technical University and sponsored Coconino Community College programs to train the local workforce for high demand local jobs. And here are a couple of the programs that our sponsorship went to, which was apartment maintenance and pre-health program. These are in high demand up in that area. And so we sponsored those programs by working with the Coconino Community College and the Navajo Nation to identify programs that they felt would be beneficial. And we continue, even with the closure of NGS, to provide a scholarship fund for those that live in the NGS area. I've got to quickly go here. We have entered into a long-term purchase power agreement for what's called Kayenta 1 and Kayenta 2 solar projects on the Navajo Nation. And we've now entered into another long-term PPA with Cameron Solar, which was announced in 2022. That's a 200 megawatt project to be located on the Navajo Nation, set to be operational by the end of 2023. Light Up Navajo, I mentioned, we participate in that. We have done this twice. We've connected a number of Navajo homes to electricity. We send crews up there who work for a couple of weeks at a time up to do that work. We also did some work for Page. Page identified that their primary focus was on housing. And so we funded a housing study and provided technical expertise to create a library of real estate and accompanying assets that the town could then use. And we also developed some strategic housing and planning initiative. We did a zoning audit, did a number of other things that the town is now using as it pursues its future without the Navajo Generating Station. Just a couple of quick lessons learned. NGS that we learned from the closure of NGS and that we're applying now as we look to close other coal-fired facilities. One, start as early as possible. The impacted community has to lead. They have to identify where they want to go, what the economic development would be with input and perhaps suggestions, but the community does need to lead that. Every community is different. And the first step that we determined was you need to do an economic impact study and create a stakeholder group. I'll stop with that. The slide has some additional high-level lessons learned. And with that, I'll thank you and stop my sharing.
Perfect timing, Carolee. That was excellent. Thanks for sharing that detailed case study with Salt River Project, the Navajo Nation, and a variety of different entities. I think that was an engaging example of stakeholder engagement. And as you indicated, beginning, including, and emphasizing and being led by communities, which also helps address one of the questions voiced by one of the attendees about community engagement. So thank you so much for that. Next up, we have Shweta Srinivasan. She is a program manager for energy at the India Climate Collaborative. Shweta, please.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you for USAID for inviting me onto this great discussion. I think it's also a good opportunity for me to take from the program perspective and try to present at a conceptual level what we're trying to do. So that will really be the focus of my interventions. Just going to share screens. Please let me know when it's visible.
That looks great. Thanks.
I think Sandeep's already done a wonderful job of bringing a lot of the bottom-up information in terms of the case study from Jharkhand. What I'm going to try, I may be defining the coal ecosystem a little differently in terms of also trying to identify what kind of actors there are. So please bear with me. Just going to provide you a bit of context about the India Climate Collaborative, what our perspective and reading of the coal ecosystem is in India. And then, of course, a little insight into what we're doing with the Just Transitions India program. So I think most of us who are listening in or the panel is quite aware of why climate change is a critical issue in general, But in India, we also have this dual issue of being also quite vulnerable to climate change, as well as extreme flooding events, as well as having the onus of trying to transition from fossil fuel intensive energy systems and transport systems to low carbon or moving to a net zero pathway. So in the India Climate Collaborative was really set up with the aim of trying to set up an agenda which is very India-centric. And we wanted to move really at a more catalytic speed and trying to mobilize funding towards sectors which were underserved or under-addressed, and trying to bring about a more collaborative atmosphere within the ecosystem. So really in terms of the just transition example, with there are great pockets of amazing research that are happening in terms of case studies that are being documented, but we really want to make sure that the actions scale up with multiple levers, whether it's with policy, whether it's with civil society organizations and collaboration. And with that, I'll just try to give you a little bit of insight into how we are viewing the just transitions piece for the coal sector in India. So Sandeep covered a lot more detail, and I won't go into the nuance apart from just saying that there are a large number of dependencies, socioeconomic dependencies across India. We have estimates that are suggesting that there's 13 million plus livelihoods linked to India's coal sector. Sandeep's own study, has indicated that there is dependence, and this also reflects to one of the questions that came up. There's a very high dependence on the coal-based ecosystem in terms of nearly 40% of the districts being affected. So if we were to just close all coal right now, there would be a lot of losers as opposed to people who are benefiting from it. And while the focus, rightly so, has been on multiple coal mining districts, there are also allied sectors in terms of the coal thermal power plants. We've made massive investments in terms of transport logistics infrastructure across the country. And there are implications there which haven't necessarily been mapped, and also are kind of part of India's growth story. Other than that, the other element which Sandeep really did bring out was also that historically coal has come up in spaces and in districts where a lot of the communities are already facing really harsh conditions in terms of having being multidimensionally poor, having social and health infrastructure deficits. And the key takeaway here, at least the way ICC would approach it, is to bring about some convergence with developmental initiatives already on the ground. So there was a question that was raised pertaining to involvement of civil society organizations and community representation. Unfortunately, a lot of the regions and communities there are not necessarily concerned about a 10-year away problem, but more now in here problem. And the coal phase down has really indicated nationally that this is likely to happen. So planning processes need to kick in now, but on the ground communities are definitely more engaged with current developmental deficit issues. So unless and until that the planning processes very categorically engage and socialize the urgency of planning for a tomorrow which is potentially fossil free, one may not be able to get the community representation one would want in the planning processes. So I can get into this, how we hope to do this with a few problem statements that we have identified to take up. I think Sandeep adequately covered the aspect around coal cess and revenues from coal affecting and creating heavy economic dependency in several of these regions. But the aspect that I'd also like to highlight here is there's a major shift in the thinking of big companies involved in the coal value chain. The India's largest coal mining entity, which is CIL, has come up with a diversification plan in terms of trying to diversify their business model. However, it is still kind of, they're still trying to figure out the hows and the wheres. And amongst them is really trying to also try to see whether there can be convergence for land reclamation projects, or even in terms of assets that are already there on the ground near these coal mines, how to kind of align them with future projects that they may have, coal gasification projects amongst them. You also have several other entities like the NTPC who want to invest in renewable energy. The only one point that I'd like to make here is often there is a thinking that fossil fuel based jobs can be done away with because it opens up avenues for green energy and green energy jobs. However, in the Indian context, that's not necessarily true unless very actively planned for. By that, I mean, you can easily look at this map on the right side, and you can see that there are several regions in the east and in central India which are heavily dependent on coal. However, a large number of the renewable energy, or even say electric mobility-based new automotive manufacturing components, etc., all those higher skilled, greener energy jobs which are likely to come up are going to be in the southern and eastern regions. So there is a geographical mismatch which one needs to very consciously plan for, and ensure that the plans that are emerging from these regions which are economically dependent also enable opening up those avenues, because they're not even thinking about it. One of our partners also did a very detailed assessment, and even Sandeep has done a lot of work in this. They are clearly showing that there are economic diversification opportunities around green infrastructure. However, they are not necessarily being planned for. There are not proper pre-feasibility studies in place, for example, for even looking at green hydrogen infrastructure in these beds, which may actually, where you may actually see resource convergence happening. I think with that, I'll just try to broadly introduce how we're planning to go about this in the next few years. In the next few years, the Just Transitions India program is really trying to support communities and regions that will be most affected to by the move away from fossil fuel, fossil fuels. And the focus is on three key sectors: the coal ecosystem, which I spoke about, mobility, land use, and we seek to really try to do a lot of field building activities, co-create regional economic diversification plans with active community engagements. Some of our partners have also started creating district level and very local level forums in order to get the right kind of stakeholders to think about these. The other aspect they've also been doing is from a skilling point of view, where there are already plans in place, trying to do a baselining of the skilling needs of the communities, and also identify what is the gap. Supposing there is a gap in terms of having several of these communities have a very heavy focus on, large set of workers who may not be higher than semi-skilled workers, and for a lot of the transition that needs to happen depending on the economic diversification plan, there may be a heavy skilling requirement, which cannot be met through the existing institutions that are there. So there is really a very complex kind of set of variables that need to be balanced at the same time in order for things to happen at scale. And cognizant of that, we really want to create this platform for collaboration, give grants and technical assistance by supporting several of these community-based pilots, creating strategic communications, as well as supporting any bottom-up assessments from these regions. Yeah, so these are just some of the key guiding principles for the Just Transition India program. I'm going to focus on the first 4. I already alluded to some of these elements. The 1 or 2 elements that I also like to focus on is the need for livelihood based like scenario planning for future livelihood options. And that is something that we're also trying to ensure that any affected stakeholders are not necessarily just brushed off in advance. So that's the broad guiding principles with which we are trying to get into the coal ecosystem. We've broadly identified 3 or 4 sub-verticals that we'd like to work in and work with. Sandeep already highlighted the coal mining sector, but we also want to, for example, the coal mine closure plan. There's a comprehensive framework that's being mulled and drawn up with international assistance by the government of India. However, there are severe gaps. It's in the pre-feasibility stage in terms of even understanding what would be needed and what is required for the coal mine closure planning framework. And we really want to make sure that these bottom-up case studies add up and link up to that wireframing at the national level to the extent possible. The other aspect is also in terms of trying to make sure all these affected stakeholders, whether it is in the direct coal mining districts or in the second order coal sector, the communities dependent on coal or allied sectors, whether it's transport, logistics, or even government stakeholders at the regional level. So a lot of this conversation has largely been with national entities, but also try to go to the local and district level and get them involved in regional planning and economic diversification planning exercises. And really the biggest element is also trying to make sure that a lot of this evidence can be used as and when decision points are emerging at the national, regional planning level. So what we're also trying to do, and this is a possible example, is to look at, for example, the coal thermal power plant phasing down concern. We know for a fact that India is heavily dependent on coal-based electricity, and we also have massive reserves. So we are not likely to draw up a plan to phase out coal anytime soon. But when it does happen, there is going to be a major requirement in mapping the socioeconomic vulnerability associated with thermal power plant closures, as well as trying to identify the criticality of which thermal power plants need to exist. Typically, coal power plant closures would happen mainly driven by regulatory requirements or environmental regulation, and looking at whether there is techno-economic feasibility, grid stability considerations. However, there is a need to look at socioeconomic criticality of the plant while drawing up these longer-term closure plans. And for that, we're trying to also set up the evidence base, similarly for the other second-order sectors, whether it's transport, logistics, or repurposing the existing infrastructure for other uses. My final point really that I want to make is on financial convergence. So I mentioned the comprehensive mine closure framework. We know that the active funds, so there's a lot of international bilateral funding that's flowing into India. We also have these local funds, which Sandeep also in his presentation alluded to, whether it is the DMF funding, the local district revenues, or even if you talk about CSR spending, which is corporate social responsibility spending, which is quite heavy in several of these affected districts. And there is a major economic dependence on that spending. But in terms of ensuring that that feeds into the just transition planning exercises, or even understanding where these funds are better utilized and why, and coming up with a framework, it's very critical that that be done soon, because right now there are accruals, there is a lot of interest even from grant capital. So there is a need to unlock a lot of these financial avenues in order to be able to scale up. And what we're trying to do is to get the bottom up to feed into the top down planning processes, and ensure that there is some convergence points for a lot of these financial avenues also. So really, I guess my last point would be on trying to just say that this program is meant to be kind of designed to increase the JT narrative in a lot of the planning processes at the sub-regional and national level. We're trying to create a lot more, rather than just doing incremental action, but also trying to see how we can scale up and prioritize such that the efforts scale up and there is enough cross-learning that occurs. And finally, of course, we're also trying to build capacity at the subnational level in order to even get civil society organizations who have been doing, say, primarily, what one would call developmental focused activities on poverty alleviation or health or education, but for them also to become a part and bring on those regional stakeholders, local stakeholders to be part of that conversation for the economic diversification planning. So we're just really trying to build institutional capacity in these critical regions as well. So with that, I guess I'd just like to thank you for your time. And again, thank you to the community. I know this was a slightly different approach that was shared, but just trying to contextualize that these concepts are equally relevant while one plans programmatic interventions for scale.
Excellent. Thank you, Shweta. And I really appreciated how you clearly outlined guiding principles that can serve as a framework or examples for the attendees to consider how to apply a just transition to their own situations. And then if you'd kindly discontinue sharing your screen, and I'll invite the other panelists, Carrie Lee and also Sandeep, to turn back on your videos for a bit of an open Q&A. And I have a starter question for everyone. We had a few posted in the chat, which I'll get to just in a minute. But as a starter question, it was interesting to hear from the variety of examples, US, various parts of India, South Africa as well. And each situation location is different, which then brings up a question about how do you find the ecosystem, the major components, but then also the stakeholders involved in the dialogue discussion of what a just transition is. Maybe in order of the presenters. So Sandeep, Carolee, and then Shweta, could you give the attendees on the call here today about how do you or how does your institution approach what is in the ecosystem? Who's involved?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think that is a very bottom-up process, in my opinion. I don't think you can define a universal ecosystem and then, transplant that for each country. I think you can have broad understanding of what that might contain and what the broad principles are. For example, I'll give you, there are lots of ecosystem definitions that I have seen in Europe, right? They don't have what is a very large section of Indian coal workers is informal workers. So unless those ecosystems are defined from a ground up point of view, I think it's very, very difficult, and they'll miss out on key components of the ecosystem. The railway is another great example, which only exists not in every country, but in India's case, it's like so dependent. Like if coal finishes, like our passengers will suffer, and they'll pay like through the roof, like it's all subsidized. So each ecosystem is different, but nonetheless, it's good that we recognize that it's an ecosystem and it's not just a jobs problem.
Good, thank you. Carolee?
Yeah, I would agree with Sandeep. You have to look at each specific situation that you're dealing with. For the Navajo generating station, we were sole sourced from a mine that was also located on the Navajo Nation. So our primary ecosystem really was the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe that depended on that, and some nearby communities. We knew when Navajo was going to close that both of the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe were going to lose major sources of their revenues. Because of the coal royalties, lease payments, and quite importantly, we were the highest paying jobs on the Navajo Nation. So, but like Sandeep said, we felt it was critical to work with the communities immediately surrounding, with our employees, with the specifically the Navajo chapters that were going to be most directly impacted by the closure of Navajo Generating Station, the community of Page, which is off the Navajo reservation, but where a number of our employees lived. And we worked with Navajo, with both the Indian tribes and the communities to identify what they felt were economic issues, and to work with them, as Sandeep said, to build it from the ground up, taking their input on where we needed to go.
Perfect, thank you. Shweta?
It's really interesting to hear these perspectives, because I totally agree with both Sandeep and Carly that it needs to be very context specific and driven by what is the problem we're trying to solve for. And at ICC, when we look at an ecosystem approach in general, what we're trying to do is ensure that there's more cross-fertilization of ideas, and trying to get several actors of different standing to interact and come together to solve together. Unfortunately, in the Indian context, and also from the Just Transition Program concept, the ecosystem is quite limited if you look at it in terms of the actors that are involved right now. And when we are trying to bring more capacity of actors into the ecosystem itself, one would definitely need to look at not just those who are, actors who are on the ground affected, but also actors who can influence and enable change. So for me, then the ecosystem also would include the funding community, people who can bring about some technological innovation in order to bring that, to kind of make it more action-oriented than just solving defining the problem boundaries. So that would just be one add-on.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for that feedback and insight. A question that Bill Mead kindly posed, and this is an open question to anyone that would enjoy answering it, is he indicated that his understanding is that the just transition has its roots in environmental justice, whereby impoverished communities are subject to environmental impacts due to their proximity to sources of pollution. Does the just transition capture the benefits of reduced emissions, not just GHG, on those impoverished communities?
I mean, I can start to try to answer this question. It's a very good question and complex question. I mean, in many contexts, the environmental justice issue overlaps with the just transition issue, because when you think about the coal, let's take coal as an example, and when I think about it in two contexts that I know well, South Africa and India, like people who suffer also work in the coal mines, right? So you cannot like separate them completely, although you can say that there's layers of some people who benefit more and the others less within a community. But nonetheless, like if you go to some of the districts in India, like people are breathing that dirty air, people are consuming that dirty water and so on. And so there is a lot of convergence into that. And that's why we bring this concept of underrepresented stakeholders, which in this case is often people who have historically suffered. Maybe they are working in a coal mine today and making some earning, but they have suffered from generations. They may suffer in future generations if just transition is not addressed. So that's how I see the convergence of the two. I think you cannot separate them. Like they're quite connected and they overlap.
Very good. Carolee Schweda, anything else to add?
I would just add that just transition could be considered as a subset of the environmental justice thing conceptually, but in the Indian context, there's been historical injustices that have happened in these regions due to the way the coal mines have been planned and the workers have been deprived of their land rights, etc. So when you're looking at just transitions for these workers, you have to add a double layer of justice, I guess.
Got it. Thank you. And then if I could direct a targeted question to Sandeep and Shweta. So this is from Ayushi Sarahan. How can skill development programs promoting diverse sources of livelihoods tackle low education and skill levels of the majority of workers in the coal sector in India?
Yeah, Sandeep, I'll try to take this and then. So when we're looking at skill development programs or even trying to create skilling modules in affected regions, which are still advanced theoretically or hypothetically, if a particular region has come up with an economic diversification plan, what we're trying to do is really co-create that economic diversification plan and also baseline a lot of the skill gap that exists to meet that. And that's really the starting point for any skilling initiatives and trying to make sure that skilling initiatives are not just in terms of how many coal workers are skilled, but also in terms of what outcomes you want that skilling initiative to meet. So I guess in our program designs, what we're trying to really enforce as a guiding principle is that element. Sandeep, would you want to?
Yeah, I think, in general, what I find very challenging in the just transition understanding of skill and retraining is like skilling for what? Like that question has stayed with me for the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. Like, okay, we always often refer to like retraining as a very key component of just transition, but I think it has to be based on like what is the next industry that is coming up in that area, and perhaps some of them don't need any skill for environmental remediation work, for example, right? And so as we think about bringing a cluster of industries in the local regions, what are the skills available and what are the skills of today and what are the skills of I think that mapping is critical before we can actually start skilling people into something. Those jobs may not even exist if this is not done in this order.
Mm-hmm. Very good. A question for Carolee, if I could, from Elena Van Hova. What are the biggest challenges, or what were the biggest challenges to closing the plan and enabling a just transition in the Navajo Nation?
Well, there are a number of challenges, of course. I think for us in particular, we were very focused on our employees and their families. And so we put a lot of effort into working with our employees and the Navajo Nation and others to identify where new jobs might be, and the economic development was important. To kind of go back to, I guess it's sort of a question in the chat. The Navajo generating station, when it was in full operation, had 500 employees. If you close that plant down and you build a solar facility on that, that's not going to take 500 employees. It might during construction. So you could get good construction jobs, but once the plant is up and running, it takes less. So we couldn't just simply look to and work on, those types of replacements for the Navajo generating station. We wanted to look for economic development opportunities that would allow the employees to transition to other jobs. But because we were very focused on our employees, I guess I would just list that. There's a lot of challenges just in trying to get everybody to the table in the time that we had to negotiate the documents that we needed in order to keep the plant open. It took tremendous amount of effort on the part of a number of parties to get those done so the plant could continue to operate for an additional couple of years.
Excellent, thank you. And if I could expand on that, a question that was asked by Padu Padma Nabhan is a question for everyone. And if Carolee addressed a little bit, Shweta and Sandeep, maybe you can expand a little bit more. And the examples that you're seeing and interacting with, are you getting the sense that can new employment opportunities be created at the scale needed to replace the lost jobs?
This is my favorite question, so I'll try to take this question. The answer technically is yes. I mean, most of the studies, including my own during my PhD, shows that the benefits of this transition will be more, and there'll be more net jobs in most countries. Not all, not in every context. Then in that, so if there is more jobs, then would those jobs go to the same people who will lose jobs, or would it go to the new people? I mean, as Shweta was pointing out, like in many countries, if you look at most countries, like the spatial geography of clean energy is very different from the spatial geography of coal. So that's one big challenge, whether even those more jobs would go. The second challenge is like a lot of these clean energy jobs, and this is based on initial evidence, is often construction temporary natured jobs rather than, like permanent nature unionized jobs. Now I understand the tension because we are also trying to transition, so we need least cost. So when you have least cost, you pay less to your employees, so therefore union. So I completely get that tension. So I think in terms of pure numbers, there may be more jobs, but will those jobs go to the same people? Will those be quality jobs? Remains a very, very big question in most countries.
Yeah, I think my sense is, at least I'm not even going to get into the net bit, but just in terms of even looking at a microcosm of the coal mining districts and trying to see whether they will have jobs, that really depends on how well they plan their economic diversification plans. And because a lot of them are not going to necessarily want to travel, they have also, I mean, unless you want them to become migrant labor, it probably will not happen. And which is why that economic diversification planning becomes even more critical in terms of trying to make sure that the new jobs that are created and the new avenues that are created and the new investments that flow into that region actually benefit the affected workers.
Sandeep, back to you. Thanks, Shweta.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add one thing, that I think we have to think beyond like clean energy jobs. I think we have to think about a cluster of industries, like what's wrong with tourism, for example, right? Tourism can actually create a lot of jobs, more jobs than, and more permanent nature jobs than other industries. So my sense is that I think we have to scale back on our thinking that clean energy will sort of like clean energy jobs will kind of replace this fossil fuel jobs and its ecosystem. I think we need to think of a cluster approach, from ranging from tourism to agriculture to depending on the local context, and in that renewable energy can play a role.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you both for sharing. Following on from another question from an attendee is a really great question about gender, is how important is gender as a variable in planning a just transition? And how does a transition away from generations of long dependence on coal impact women differently than it does on men? And how does that affect the strategy one takes for planning a just transition? That's an open question as well.
Okay, I'll start with this question. It's a very difficult question, very, very important and very difficult question. One of the challenges, at least in many parts of the world, is like this is a very male-dominated sector, generally the fossil fuel sector. So even if you want to just start the conversation about just transition, it's really, really hard to get diverse stakeholders. I mean, when we host closed door meetings with very, very senior officials, you always have this like men showing up. But what do? Do you engage or do you not engage? Right? Like, so it's a very difficult question, and something that I'm not sure how to grapple with at a level, because it's always dominated by like the really one set of gendered people, and but it has to be a key component. I think in terms of impacts, since the conversation itself is dominated by men and male here, um, the woman doesn't even have a representation in what the solution should be. So I think that the impact in that sense is quite large.
Thank you. Any furthers? Please.
Yeah, I think the only element that I'd add to that is in terms of the affected stakeholders, at least based on studies that we're seeing from the ground, etc. A large number of the people who are on the who are in the coal worker mining community, or say even in the informal economy or the formal economy around that region, tend to be lower skilled, have less agency in general in terms of having economic agency and decision-making power. So it is also a function of their, the loss of livelihood or opportunities from that transition really affecting them could be compounding that loss of agency. So I guess that would just be one observation. Don't know how it can be addressed yet because of the issues that Sandeep also brought out, that in terms of the planning process and their involvement. I think one of the things what we're trying to really do is trying to involve local civil society organizations who have been working on gender and development adjacent sectors on some of these, and trying to get them to be a pivot point for improving that representation. But we'll have to work out how.
Very good. And if I could shoot two short questions, one for Shweta and then one for Carolee, is for Shweta, in India, states that are rich in mineral deposits are also tend to score fairly poorly in human development indexes and are behind in SDG goals. So if the background of such states are already riddled with inequalities and are lagging on those indicators, where exactly should the just transition policies begin?
Can you just repeat the last bit? I think I missed the.
Yes.
Okay, I can see it in the chat. I can see it in the chat.
Given that significant inequalities exist today in the states with heavy mineral deposits and fossil fuel generation, and there's a significant background context beyond just the mineral access and fossil fuel generation, where should just transition policies begin, noting that it's not just the fossil fuel generation, but all of the other aspects of society and the ecosystem that have challenges with them as well?
I think the answer to the where is very much rooted in the need for place-based assessments and happening bottom up. I don't necessarily feel that, and honestly, the national policy planning framework will not be able to account for it. It may at best be able to support via framing of regional and local decision making. But when it comes to having just transition policies, it definitely needs to be at the local, district, regional level first. And that framework needs to inform up to the national planning processes and also inform where the money flows. So that would be the ideal way in which it would happen. And as I said, that's why I also see this as an opportunity to bring about, that environmental justice lens back to these regions. So, yeah.
Very good. Thanks, Shweta. So a question for Carolee. What entities came to the table with investment or commitments, like financial commitments, in supporting the just transition for the case of the Navajo generating station?
So at least all of the work that I described that was done was really funded by the owners, the participants in the Navajo generating station, and then additionally by SRP, because we felt an additional obligation or responsibility for our employees. There were other organizations that did work with us. We worked with the Northern Arizona University. I think we worked with some folks from ASU to work with us on economic studies. So those organizations provided good input and guidance as we looked at what the economic impact study would be and what some of the options were. Local community college, local chapter representatives, the Navajo Nation government, and the local community. There is an effort at the federal level, I think, as you were mentioning, to perhaps start doing some funding for coal transition on a broader level. And we'd like to see that. We've been working with the folks in DC to see if we can facilitate some of that. There were a number of organizations obviously involved before the plant shut down that wanted the plant shut down. So they were obviously engaged at least in developing or getting us to the point where the plant was shut down. And they did provide input along the way.
Perfect. Thank you for that response. And so one of the reasons why I find that very useful and interesting about which entities are showing up in a financial sense is as we take a look at global markets and particularly global financing institutions, they're increasingly emphasizing climate change in their investment strategies or also other ESG metrics in their investment decision making. And so that might be a mechanism as we look forward to the next 5 to 10 years as to how to enhance and accelerate the just transition given the changing dispositions of where the large international financing institutions are investing their monies. And today, I wanted to thank again Sandeep, Shweta, and Carolee, and then also Sheila, Kristen, and Marjorie for providing some of the opening remarks in a dialogue that allowed us to understand more about what the just transition is, various ways to describe the full ecosystem and impact all of the stakeholders, and how to engage them in a way of consensus making as we take on responsibility of helping co-create what the just transition is and how to execute on that. And then next, we can look to further dialogues and discussions about how to approach the ecosystem definition, stakeholder engagement strategies, and also hearing from additional stakeholders such as communities, workers, and more about what does it mean from all lenses or all viewpoints, and how do we architect a successful transition together. So thanks everyone for joining. We hope you had a great and informative time today. Do stay in touch for further webinars by USDA and the AMPA program. Thanks all. See you.